It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that blends into the background of people's lives, remembered only as another routine errand checked off a list. The grocery store on Main Street was crowded, humming with the familiar sounds of the weekend rush. Shopping carts rattled across the tiled floor. Cash registers beeped in steady, mechanical rhythm. Somewhere near the bakery, a child laughed while tugging on their mother's sleeve, begging for cookies. Nothing about the moment felt special. At Register 4, a black man in his early 30s stood quietly in line. He was tall, neatly dressed in a plain white shirt and faded blue jeans, holding a small handbasket instead of a cart. Inside were only a few items: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some fruit. The kind of purchase that suggested he wasn't stocking up, just stopping by on his way home. He looked relaxed, unbothered. The stress that seemed to cling to everyone else in the store hadn't found him. The cashier, a young woman no older than 22, scanned his items while chatting with him about the weather. She joked about how Missouri couldn't decide between summer heat and sudden rainstorms. He smiled, shaking his head, adding a light comment that made her laugh. It was a simple exchange, the kind that happens thousands of times a day and means nothing until something interrupts it. Behind him stood an older woman, late 60s maybe, with sharp features and a tight expression. Her shopping cart was filled to the brim, boxes stacked high, bags of produce threatening to spill over the edge. But she wasn't focused on her groceries. Her attention never left the man in front of her. She shifted from foot to foot, sighing loudly. Her fingers tapped against the cart handle in irritation. Every few seconds, her eyes darted toward him, then away, then back again. There was something tense about her posture, something coiled and impatient, as if she'd been carrying anger long before she walked into the store. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? People were busy, distracted, lost in their own thoughts, their own errands, their own lives. The store was just background noise, until it wasn't. The woman leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between herself and the man. Her voice dropped, low enough that she may have thought only he would hear it. "Oh, why don't you go back to Africa?" For a brief, fragile second, the words seemed to float in the air, almost unreal. Then they landed. The cashier's hand froze mid-scan. The familiar beep of the register cut off abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its place. Conversations nearby trailed off, one by one, as people turned their heads toward the sound. A couple standing 2 lines over stopped talking entirely. "See?" Someone near the frozen foods aisle inhaled sharply. It was as if the entire store collectively held its breath. The man didn't respond right away. He didn't turn around. He didn't flinch. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes or raise his voice. For a moment, it wasn't even clear if he had heard her at all. The woman straightened her back, her chin lifting slightly as though she were waiting, almost hoping for a reaction. Her lips pressed into a thin, defiant line. The silence, instead of discouraging her, seemed to fuel something inside her. A mother nearby instinctively pulled her young child closer, resting a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. A teenage girl glanced at her father, her eyes wide, silently asking if he was going to say something. He looked away, uncomfortable, pretending to study the candy display. Near the deli counter, a man slowly raised his phone. He hesitated, unsure whether recording was the right thing to do, or whether this was a moment better left unseen. Still, the man in line remained motionless. The tension grew thicker by the second. It pressed down on everyone in the checkout area, heavy and suffocating. People expected something loud, something explosive, a confrontation they could either condemn or secretly justify. That's how these moments usually went. A shout, a curse, an argument that spiraled until security intervened. But this moment was different. The man's silence stretched on long enough to make people uneasy. Long enough for discomfort to replace anticipation. Long enough that the woman's confidence wavered just slightly, though she refused to show it. The cashier glanced up at him, her face flushed, eyes uncertain. She didn't know whether to apologize, intervene, or simply stay quiet. Her hands hovered over the register, unsure what to do next. Then, slowly, deliberately, the man began to turn. It wasn't a sharp movement. There was no aggression in it. He didn't spin around or step forward. He simply pivoted, calm and controlled, as if he were taking the time to consider every eye now fixed on him. You could hear it, the silence, no carts rolling, no beeping registers, no chatter. Just the faint hum of the store's overhead lights and the soft thud of someone's heart beating a little faster than usual. When he finally faced her, his expression wasn't angry. That was what unsettled people the most. There was no rage in his eyes, no humiliation, no fear. Just a steady calm, the kind that made it impossible to predict what would come next. The woman's jaw tightened. Her grip on the cart handle grew firmer, knuckles whitening as if she were bracing herself. Everyone waited. For shouting. For chaos. For the moment to break open. Instead, the man simply stood there, meeting her gaze without flinching. And in that quiet, suspended moment, before a single word left his mouth, the entire store seemed to realize something profound. Whatever was about to happen next wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be unforgettable. Before anyone in that grocery store knew his name, they had already decided who they thought he was. To most of the people standing in those checkout lines, he was just another customer. Easy to overlook, easy to forget. A black man in his early 30s, quietly minding his own business, holding a small basket instead of a cart. Nothing flashy, nothing demanding attention. But there was more to him than what the surface revealed. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered without being intimidating. His white shirt was clean but simple, the kind someone wears because it's comfortable, not because it makes a statement. His jeans showed signs of wear at the knees, the subtle marks of someone who lived an active, working life. His posture was relaxed, confident in a way that didn't need to announce itself. This wasn't a man looking for validation. His face carried a calm familiarity, the look of someone who had learned long ago how to navigate spaces where he wasn't always welcomed. His eyes were observant, steady, taking in details without lingering too long. He wasn't scanning the room for threats, but he wasn't unaware either. Moments earlier, before the silence had swallowed the store whole, he had been smiling. The cashier, a young woman with bright blue nail polish and nervous energy, had joked about the weather again. He laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine, and replied that Missouri weather had a sense of humor no one could predict. It was the kind of exchange that made long shifts easier, that reminded people there were still decent moments tucked into ordinary days. She liked him instantly, not because he said anything extraordinary, but because he was kind without trying, polite without being stiff. He made eye contact when he spoke. He listened when she talked. When her scanner lagged for a second, he didn't sigh or complain. He just waited, patient and unbothered. Small things. The kind of things that say more about a person than they realize. What no one in that line could see was the weight he carried quietly, the history etched into the way he held himself. He had learned restraint early in life, learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. Learned that not every provocation deserved a reaction, especially when the cost of reacting could be far greater than the satisfaction of responding. This wasn't his first encounter with ignorance. It wasn't his first time hearing words meant to shrink him, to erase him, to remind him that no matter where he stood, someone would always question his right to be there. He had heard slurs whispered under breath, comments passed off as jokes, glances that lingered just a little too long. Each time he made a choice. Sometimes he walked away. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he stayed silent. But always he remembered who he was. That was why, when the woman's words cut through the store, "Go back to Africa," he didn't immediately turn around. He didn't need to. The insult didn't land the way she expected it to. It didn't explode inside him or send heat rushing to his face. Instead, it settled somewhere familiar, a reminder of something he already knew, that ignorance often revealed more about the speaker than the target. The man took a slow breath, steadying himself, not because he was afraid, but because he was deliberate. People watching mistook his stillness for shock. They were wrong. He was thinking. He thought about his father, who had taught him that dignity was not weakness. That responding with anger might feel good in the moment, but responding with purpose could change a room. He thought about his mother, who had told him that silence could be powerful, but only when followed by truth. He thought about the people watching him now, the cashier frozen and uncertain, the children wide-eyed and absorbing every detail, the bystanders unsure whether to intervene or look away. He knew that whatever he did next would ripple outward, that this wasn't just about him and the woman behind him anymore. This was a moment, and moments like these had consequences. As he slowly turned to face her, his expression remained composed. Not cold, not distant, just steady. His eyes met hers without challenge, without submission. Without submission. He didn't tower over her, didn't step into her space. He simply stood there present. That alone unsettled her. She had expected anger, maybe even fear. She had expected him to shrink or snap, but his calm disrupted the script she had written in her mind. For the first time since she spoke, uncertainty flickered across her face. The man said nothing yet. He let the silence work. In that quiet, people began to see him differently, not as a stereotype, not as a headline, but as a human being, grounded, thoughtful, unshaken. Someone in line shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had already judged him without knowing a single thing about his life. Someone else lowered their phone, suddenly aware that this wasn't entertainment. The cashier swallowed hard, her eyes glistening as she watched him stand there with quiet strength. She didn't know why, but she felt protective of him, proud even, despite having met him only minutes ago. The man's presence filled the space without force, and in that moment, before he spoke a single word, it became clear to everyone watching. They had underestimated him. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because true strength rarely announces itself. And whatever he was about to say next, whatever calm, measured words he chose, was going to change the tone of that room forever. Before that moment, she had blended into the background of the store just like everyone else. Another customer, another cart, another face in the crowd. But now all eyes were on her. The woman stood rigidly behind the man, her hands gripping the handle of her shopping cart as if it were an anchor. She looked to be in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. Her hair was neatly styled, sprayed into place, not a strand out of order. She wore a sensible jacket and sensible shoes, the kind chosen for practicality rather than comfort. Everything about her appearance suggested control, routine, certainty. Her face, however, told a different story. Her lips were pressed tight, jaw clenched, nostrils flaring slightly as she breathed through her nose. There was irritation there, but also something deeper, a resentment that looked old. Worn? Familiar, the kind of anger that hadn't been born in the grocery store aisle but carried in with her long before she arrived. She had said the words without hesitation, without fear, without shame. To her they had come naturally, as if repeating something she'd heard before, something she believed had a right to be spoken out loud. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't whispered either. Her tone had been sharp, dismissive, casual in the most dangerous way, as though she were stating a fact. Now, standing in the silence she herself had created, she shifted her weight uncomfortably. The room no longer felt like it was on her side. She could sense it. The stillness wasn't approval. It was scrutiny. People were looking at her. Really looking at her. Really looking at her. A young mother near the end of the aisle stared openly, her expression tight with disbelief. A college-aged man frowned, shaking his head slowly as if trying to process what he'd just heard. An older gentleman with silver hair avoided her gaze entirely, suddenly fascinated by the floor tiles. No one spoke. That unsettled her. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin in quiet defiance. If anyone expected her to back down, they didn't understand her. She had lived long enough to believe she was entitled to her opinions, long enough to mistake familiarity for correctness. In her mind, she wasn't the problem. The world had changed. People had become too sensitive. That's what she told herself. That's what she told friends. That's what she believed. And yet, standing there now surrounded by strangers who were not nodding, not agreeing, not laughing along, something didn't feel right. The man had turned to face her. She met his gaze, prepared for confrontation, prepared to defend herself, prepared even to escalate. But what she saw in his eyes threw her off balance. There was no fury there, no venom, no contempt. Instead, there was calm. A quiet intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see straight through the layers of certainty she had built around herself. She tightened her grip on the cart handle. Well, she snapped, her voice sharper than before. "Oh, you heard me." Her words echoed slightly in the quiet store, brittle and defensive. It was clear now she wasn't just provoking him anymore, she was trying to regain control of the moment. "You don't belong here," she added, her voice rising just enough to make heads turn again. "A people like you never did." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." A teenager muttered under their breath, "That's messed up." The cashier's face flushed bright red. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the counter, unsure whether she should call a manager or step away. She looked at the man, then at the woman, her eyes darting between them like she was watching something fragile teeter on the edge of breaking. The woman noticed the reactions now. She noticed the way people leaned away from her cart, as if distance alone could shield them from association. She noticed the lack of support, the absence of agreement, the silence that no longer felt neutral. Still, she refused to retreat. Years of unchecked belief had hardened her. She had said things like this before, maybe not always out loud, but often enough to herself, to people she trusted, to spaces where no one challenged her. But this space was different. This time she had said it in public, and the public was watching. The man didn't interrupt her, didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer. That made her uneasy. She had expected a reaction she could fight against, something loud enough to justify herself. But his composure robbed her of that opportunity. He just stood there, listening. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, that felt worse. Her confidence wavered just slightly. She shifted again, adjusting her stance, glancing briefly at the people around her before locking eyes with him once more. "What?" she said, more sharply now. Don't you have anything to say?" The question lingered in the air. People leaned in, sensing the turning point. This was the moment where things usually exploded, where insults were exchanged, voices raised, security called. The moment everyone would later summarize as a scene. But the man still didn't react the way she expected. Instead, he took a slow breath, not out of fear, out of control. And as he did, something subtle happened in the room. The crowd stopped seeing the woman as just an older lady with an opinion. They began to see the weight of her words, the harm, the history, the ugliness she had dragged into a place that moments earlier had been filled with nothing more than grocery lists and small talk. Her posture, once rigid and confident, now seemed tense, defensive, smaller somehow. The certainty that had fueled her words cracked at the edges. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. The question was no longer whether she had said something wrong. The question was how the man in front of her was going to respond. Because whatever he said next, whatever calm, deliberate words he chose, would determine whether this moment ended in chaos, or in something far more powerful. The store waited. It wasn't the kind of waiting marked by clocks or schedules. It was heavier than that, thick, suspended, almost physical. The kind of silence that settles into your chest and makes you aware of your own breathing. The man stood there, facing the woman, his expression unchanged. No anger, no smirk, no raised voice, just stillness. For a few seconds, no one moved. A cart sat abandoned halfway out of line. Its wheels turned awkwardly as if frozen mid-thought. A register light blinked quietly above another lane, forgotten. Somewhere in the store, a freezer hummed, the only sound brave enough to exist in the quiet. The woman shifted again, uncomfortable now. Her words had been sharp, meant to cut. But the silence blunted them. She had expected resistance, maybe even fear. She hadn't expected this. The man's calm unsettled her in a way shouting never could. It left her exposed with nothing to push against. No argument to win. No insult to deflect. Just the echo of her own words hanging in the air. People watching began to realize something was happening, something rare. This wasn't avoidance. It was restraint. The man wasn't silent because he didn't know what to say. He was silent because he was choosing how to say it. A young couple a few feet away exchanged a glance. The woman clutched her purse tighter, eyes flicking between the two figures locked in this quiet standoff. A man in a baseball cap swallowed hard, suddenly wishing he'd said something earlier, anything before it reached this point. The cashier's hands trembled where they rested on the counter. She wanted to apologize to him, wanted to say something to the woman, wanted someone else, anyone else, to take control of the situation so she wouldn't have to. But no one did, because the silence had claimed the room. The man breathed in slowly through his nose, then let the air out just as deliberately. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't exaggerated. But in the stillness, even that small movement felt significant. The woman scoffed, trying to reclaim her footing. "A what?" she said, her voice brittle now, edged with nerves she hadn't felt seconds earlier. Nothing to say? Her words bounced weakly off the silence and fell flat. He didn't answer. Oh. That was when the crowd truly began to shift. People who had been passive, who had been content to watch from the sidelines, felt something tighten inside them. The longer the quiet stretched, the harder it became to justify inaction. Silence, after all, has a way of turning inward, forcing reflection where noise offers distraction. A teenage boy glanced at his mother, his brow furrowed. He didn't fully understand the weight of what had been said, but he understood enough to know it was wrong. His mother met his eyes, her expression unreadable, then looked away quickly. An older man a few lanes down clenched his jaw. He had lived long enough to recognize moments that defined character, not just of individuals, but of communities, and this, he knew, was one of them. The woman noticed the change. She noticed the way people no longer avoided eye contact, but also weren't meeting hers. She noticed the subtle shifts, the discomfort, the quiet disapproval radiating outward. The silence that once felt like an ally now felt like a spotlight. She tightened her grip on the cart again, fingers stiff, knuckles pale. The man's eyes never left her. They weren't accusatory. They weren't cold. They were steady, unwavering, almost patient. That patience was what frightened her most, because patience meant he wasn't rattled. Patience meant he was in control. Patience meant she wasn't. The store manager hovered near the customer service desk, half hidden behind a display of gift cards. He had noticed the commotion early on, but hesitated to intervene. Training manuals didn't prepare you for moments like this, not when they unfolded slowly, quietly, with no shouting to justify stepping in. He waited now, uncertain, watching the man as much as the woman. Still, the silence held. Seconds passed. Then more. It became clear to everyone present that this pause wasn't accidental. It was intentional. The man was letting the moment breathe, letting the weight of her words sink into the room so no one could pretend they hadn't heard, hadn't understood, hadn't been affected. The woman swallowed, her confidence eroding. She glanced around, looking for support that wasn't there. No nods. No murmurs of agreement, no one coming to her defense, just eyes, watching, judging, remembering. Her voice came again, softer this time, less certain. I asked you something. That was when the man finally moved. Not forward, not aggressively. He simply adjusted his stance, squaring his shoulders, grounding himself. The movement was subtle, but it carried intention. It signaled that the silence was about to end, not with chaos, but with purpose. People leaned in without realizing they were doing it. The cashier held her breath. The man with the phone steadied his hand. The teenage girl's eyes widened. Everyone sensed it. This was the turning point. The silence that had terrified the room wasn't emptiness. It was preparation. It had stripped the moment down to its core, leaving no distractions, no excuses. Whatever came next would land cleanly, clearly, and with consequences. The man lifted his chin slightly, his gaze unwavering, his voice poised just behind his lips. And in that instant, before a single word was spoken, the entire store understood. This was no longer about an insult. It was about what happens when dignity meets ignorance and refuses to flinch. When the man finally spoke, his voice was calm, not loud, not sharp, just calm enough that people had to lean in to hear him. Do you know where I'm from? The question cut through the silence, not like a blade, but like a bell. Clear, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The woman blinked. It wasn't the response she'd prepared for. She had braced herself for anger, for accusations, for words she could twist or dismiss, but a question, asked without hostility, threw her off balance. What? She snapped, though the edge in her voice sounded thinner now, less certain. Do you know where I'm from? He repeated, his tone steady, almost conversational. People exchanged glances. The cashier's eyes widened slightly. The store manager straightened where he stood. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to signal curiosity had replaced shock. The woman scoffed, folding her arms tightly across her chest. What difference does it make? She said. I don't need to know that. The man nodded once slowly, as if he had expected that answer. It makes all the difference, he replied. He took a small step, not toward her, but into the space of the moment itself. He wasn't invading her personal space. He was anchoring himself, claiming the floor without force. I'm from here, he said. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. This city, he continued, these streets, this store. The woman's mouth opened slightly, then closed. For the first time since she'd spoken, she didn't interrupt. My family's been here for generations, he went on, his voice still even, still controlled, longer than some of the buildings around us. A few people in the crowd shifted. Someone near the magazine rack frowned thoughtfully. An older woman in a floral blouse pressed her lips together, nodding once slowly. The man gestured subtly around the store, not grandly, not dramatically, just enough to include everyone. My great-grandfather built houses here, he said. Worked as a carpenter. Helped put roofs over people's heads. People who probably never knew his name, but lived safely because of his work. The woman's eyes flickered just for a moment. My grandmother, he continued, was a nurse at the local hospital. She worked double shifts when segregation was still the rule, not the exception. She cared for people who wouldn't even look her in the eye, but she still showed up, still did her job, still saved lives. The silence in the store shifted. It was no longer tense. It was attentive. The cashier felt tears sting her eyes and didn't know why. She barely realized she had leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the counter. The man's voice didn't waver. My father served this country, he said. Put on a uniform, followed orders, believed in the promise of America even when that promise didn't always believe in him. The woman's arms loosened, just a fraction. She hadn't expected a story. She had expected a fight, and me, the man said, pausing briefly, letting the question linger. I was born here. I was born here. I went to school here. I work here. I pay taxes here. I volunteer here. He looked her directly in the eyes now, not challengingly, not accusingly. This is my home. The words echoed quietly through the checkout lanes. A man near the frozen foods aisle folded his arms, nodding once. Hi-ho. A teenager whispered, "Oh, wow," under their breath. The man with the phone lowered it slightly, suddenly unsure if recording felt right anymore. The woman swallowed. Her earlier confidence had drained away, replaced by something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. She shifted her weight, her cartwheel squeaking softly against the tile. That's not the point, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It is the point, the man replied gently. You told me to go back to Africa, but you don't know anything about me, about where I'm from, about what my family has given to this place. He paused again, not to build drama, but to give space. To remind you, he said, that belonging isn't determined by how someone looks. The woman glanced away, then back, as if searching for a response that wouldn't come. Her jaw tightened and relaxed. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Around them, the crowd had gone completely still. No phones, no whispers, no distractions, just listening. This country was built by people who look like me, the man continued, his voice calm but firm now. Renown. A people who worked and suffered and endured, often without credit, often without choice. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. And we're still here, he said. Still building, still contributing, still belonging. The woman's eyes dropped to the floor. For the first time since she'd spoken, she looked unsure of herself, not angry, not defiant, just shaken. The man took a small step back, not away from the moment, but away from confrontation. I'm not saying this to attack you, he said. I'm saying it because words matter. And when you tell someone they don't belong, you erase more than just them. You erase history. You erase truth. The cashier wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears, but unable to stop them. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Not loud, but unmistakable. Wah. The woman remained silent. Her arms fell to her sides, no longer crossed, no longer defensive. And in that quiet, it became clear to everyone watching. The power in the room had shifted, not through volume, not through force, but through a simple question and the truth that followed it. The man paused after his last words, not because he was finished, but because he wanted them to settle. The store felt different now. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with something deeper than tension, understanding maybe, or discomfort, or both. People weren't just watching anymore, they were listening, and not out of curiosity, but out of obligation. The woman still hadn't lifted her eyes from the floor. The man spoke again, his voice steady, measured, carrying a quiet gravity that filled the space without effort. You told me to go back to Africa, he said. So let me tell you what that really means. He didn't wait for her response. My ancestors didn't come here by choice, he continued. They were taken, forced, torn away from their homes, their families, their languages, everything they knew. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the cereal aisle exhaled slowly, as if they hadn't realized they were holding their breath. They were brought here in chains, the man said, his tone calm but resolute. And even then, even under cruelty most people can't imagine, they survived. The woman's shoulders stiffened. The man's eyes never left her, but his words felt as though they were meant for everyone. They built this country with their hands, he went on. brick by brick, field by field, road by road. They cleared land, planted crops, raised buildings they would never be allowed to own. The silence in the store deepened again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. My ancestors weren't allowed to rest, he said. They weren't allowed to quit. And they certainly weren't allowed to belong, but they endured anyway. The cashier's breath hitched softly. She pressed her lips together, her eyes glassy now, trying not to cry. When slavery ended, the suffering didn't, the man continued. It just changed shape. The woman's hands trembled slightly at her sides. My great-grandfather worked as a carpenter here in Missouri, he said. Not because he was given opportunity, but because he created it. He built homes for families who would never let him live in them. A man near the frozen foods aisle slowly removed his hat, holding it against his chest without quite realizing why. My grandmother, the man said, his voice softening just a fraction, was one of the first black nurses at the local hospital. She worked through segregation, through insults, through nights when patients refused her care just because of her skin. The woman's head lifted slightly now. She still showed up, he said, every day, because she believed caring for people mattered more than being accepted by them. The man paused again, not for drama, for respect. And my father, he continued, fought in Vietnam, served a country that wouldn't let him sit at certain lunch counters when he came home, a country that thanked him for his service but denied him basic dignity. A low, uneasy murmur passed through the crowd. He didn't stop believing in this country, the man said, not because it was perfect, but because he believed it could be better. The woman swallowed hard. Her face had changed. The rigid certainty that once defined her expression had cracked. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. And me, the man said, I stand here because of them, because they endured things you and I will never have to face. He gestured gently toward the store around them, the freedom to stand in line, to buy groceries, to exist without chains. That wasn't given freely. It was earned, fought for, paid for in blood and sacrifice. The words hung heavy. The woman finally looked up at him fully now. Her eyes were glossy, her jaw slack, as if the weight of history had finally landed somewhere she hadn't expected. The man softened his tone, though not his truth. I'm not telling you this to shame you, he said. I'm telling you this because when you tell someone they don't belong, you ignore everything it took for them to be standing in front of you. The store felt impossibly quiet. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum more softly. The woman's fingers curled inward, her hands no longer gripping anything for support. She looked smaller somehow, not physically but emotionally, stripped of certainty, left alone with her words. I didn't choose where my ancestors were taken from, the man said. But I choose every day to stand here, to work, to contribute, to raise my children with dignity. A tear slipped down the woman's cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed, but the damage was done. People noticed. The man nodded once, acknowledging her, not triumphantly, not smugly, just honestly. You see, he said, history isn't something we can erase just because it makes us uncomfortable. The woman shook her head faintly, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. I didn't think about it like that. Her words were fragile, uncertain, real. The man met her eyes again. Most people don't, he said gently, until they have to. The crowd felt it then. This wasn't a lecture. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning. The kind that doesn't shout or humiliate, but quietly dismantles the lies people have told themselves for years. The woman stood there, exposed and shaken, no longer defending herself. And the man, still calm, still dignified, had done something extraordinary without raising his voice once. He had forced history into the present, and no one in that store would ever forget it. Something shifted in the store after that. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced, but it was unmistakable. The man's words had done what shouting never could. They had settled into people. They sat heavy in chests and minds, refusing to be brushed aside. The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was thoughtful, reflective. People began to move differently. A woman near the magazine rack wiped at her eyes, surprised to find them wet. She hadn't expected to feel anything today beyond impatience and hunger. Now her throat felt tight, and she didn't quite understand why. A man standing by the frozen foods aisle folded his arms slowly, nodding to himself as if confirming something he'd always known but rarely confronted. He glanced at the black man with a look that wasn't pity or admiration, but respect. The cashier finally exhaled. She hadn't realized how shallow her breathing had become until that moment. Her hands, still resting on the counter, trembled less now. She felt like she was witnessing something important, something that would stay with her long after her shift ended. The woman who had spoken stood very still. Her cart remained untouched, groceries forgotten. Her shoulders were no longer squared in defiance. They had slumped slightly, weighed down by something unfamiliar, reflection. The crowd, once passive, was no longer neutral. They were participants now. A low murmur rippled through the checkout lanes, not chatter, not gossip, just quiet reactions. That took courage. He didn't yell once. He's right. The man with the phone lowered it fully and slipped it back into his pocket. Recording suddenly felt wrong, like turning something deeply human into spectacle. Some moments, he realized, weren't meant to go viral. They were meant to change people. A young boy, no older than 10, stood near his mother, clutching a candy bar in his hand. He stared openly now, his eyes bouncing between the man and the older woman. His brow furrowed, his mind working hard to understand what he was seeing. "A mom," he whispered, not as quietly as he thought. Why was she mean to him? His mother swallowed, her jaw tightening. She knelt slightly to his level, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Because sometimes people say things they haven't thought through," she said softly. "And sometimes they need to learn." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing that. The older woman heard them. She flinched, not outwardly, but internally. The sound of a child's confusion cut deeper than any argument. It stripped away justifications and left only the truth. Her words had taught something, whether she intended them to or not. The man remained composed, aware of the crowd but not performing for it. He wasn't basking in attention. If anything, he looked slightly weary, as if moments like this cost more energy than people realized. He glanced briefly around the store, meeting a few eyes, not to seek approval, just to acknowledge that he saw them seeing him. That acknowledgement mattered. The store manager finally stepped forward, clearing his throat quietly. He didn't interrupt, he didn't assert authority. He simply positioned himself nearby, present and attentive, ready to act if needed, but hoping he wouldn't have to. Then, from somewhere behind the crowd, came a sound. One clap. Slow, deliberate. It echoed off the high ceiling, startling in its simplicity. A man in a denim jacket lowered his hands after that single clap, his expression serious. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. The clap wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement. A second clap followed. Then another. Soon, a few more people joined, not loudly, not all at once. The sound built gradually, respectful rather than triumphant. A quiet ripple of hands coming together, filling the space without overwhelming it. The cashier's eyes filled completely now, tears spilling over as she pressed a hand to her mouth. She wasn't sure why she was crying, only that it felt right. The older woman stood frozen as the applause grew, her cheeks flushing. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated when she spoke. She had expected agreement or outrage. Anything but this. The clapping wasn't for her. It was for him, and that realization stung. The man raised a hand slightly, not to stop the applause, but to acknowledge it. He nodded once, his expression gentle but firm. "A thank you," he said quietly. 2 words, no speeches, no victory lap. The applause faded naturally, leaving behind something warmer than noise, connection. The store felt different now, lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been set down. The older woman's eyes glistened again. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears she didn't understand and hadn't expected. Her pride battled with something new, humility. She looked around and realized, perhaps for the first time, that she was alone in her certainty. No one was standing with her. And yet, no one was attacking her either. That somehow made it worse and better at the same time. The man turned back toward the checkout counter slightly, as if signaling that the moment didn't need to escalate further. That life could continue. That dignity didn't require dominance. But before the store could fully exhale, he spoke again, not loudly, not sharply. Just enough. "This isn't about winning," he said. "It's about understanding." The words landed gently but firmly, like a hand placed on a shoulder. The woman's head bowed. The crowd felt it then. This wasn't just a confrontation that had been diffused. It was a moment of collective reckoning where silence had turned into listening and listening had turned into change. No one in that store would leave unchanged, and somewhere in the quiet space that followed, it became clear. The real power of the moment wasn't in what had been said. It was in how many people had finally chosen to see. The applause faded, but the weight of the moment did not. It lingered in the air, settling into the quiet corners of the store, pressing gently against everyone who stood there pretending not to feel it. The checkout lines had stopped moving. Hate and impatience, things that usually thrived in crowded places, had nowhere to hide anymore. The older woman stood very still. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, but not because she was defiant. Not anymore. It was as if looking up required a strength she wasn't sure she had left. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, fingers curling and uncurling without purpose. The man noticed. He could have ended it there. Could have turned back to the counter, paid for his groceries, and walked away with his dignity intact. No one would have blamed him. Most would have applauded that choice. But he didn't. Instead, he spoke again, softly, deliberately, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without needing to reach over her. "I want you to understand something," he said. The woman's shoulders tensed. She braced herself, expecting condemnation now that the crowd was on his side. But that wasn't what came. "I'm not telling you all of this to make you feel small," he continued. "I'm telling you because hate doesn't just hurt the person it's aimed at." He paused, letting the words breathe. "It hurts the person carrying it." Her breath caught. The woman's head lifted slightly, just enough for him to see her eyes. Glassy, confused, raw. "Anger like that," he said, "it shrinks your world. It convinces you that other people's existence is a threat instead of a story you haven't taken the time to learn." The store felt impossibly quiet again. Not tense, not afraid. Honest. "I've heard words like yours before," he went on, "more times than I can count. They don't shock me anymore. They don't even surprise me." The woman swallowed hard. "But what they remind me of," he said, "is how much pain people must be carrying to say them out loud." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped at it quickly, embarrassed, but another followed. Then another followed. Then another. Her jaw quivered as the wall she had built, brick by brick over decades, began to crumble. "I didn't," she started, her voice breaking. She stopped, shaking her head. "I didn't think." The words fell apart before they could form. The man took a small step back, giving her space, not pressing the moment. "That's the thing," he said gently. "Most people don't think about the weight of their words, not until they're forced to stand in them." Her shoulders sagged. The strength she had relied on, defensiveness, certainty, pride, had abandoned her. In its place was something unfamiliar and terrifying. Self-awareness. "I was angry," she whispered, barely audible. "I don't even know why." The admission startled the crowd more than any insult had. It was honest. The man nodded once, slowly. "Anger doesn't need a reason to grow," he said, "but it does need courage to be confronted." The woman pressed a hand to her mouth as another sob escaped. She wasn't crying for attention. She wasn't performing remorse. She was unraveling. "I don't hate you," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't even know you." "That's exactly it," the man replied quietly. "You don't know me, and I don't know you, but we stood here together and this happened." He gestured gently between them, not accusingly, not triumphantly. "And now we have a choice." The woman looked up at him fully now. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression stripped bare. "What choice?" she asked. "Other than the same," he said, "or to do better." The words were simple. They didn't need embellishment. The woman nodded faintly as if the weight of them had finally found a place to land. Her lips trembled as she inhaled deeply, steadying herself. I'm sorry," she said. The apology didn't come out clean or confident. It cracked in the middle, fragile and unsure. But it was real. The store seemed to exhale all at once. The cashier let out a quiet sob she hadn't realized she was holding back. A few people wiped at their eyes. The man in the denim jacket bowed his head slightly, as if witnessing something sacred. The man met the woman's gaze, his expression calm, compassionate, but firm. "Apology accepted," he said. "Oh, but remember, sorry isn't the end. It's the beginning." She nodded again, tears streaming freely now. "I know," she whispered. "Yeah, I have a lot to think about." He offered her a small, understanding smile, not forgiveness as absolution, but forgiveness as possibility. Around them, no one spoke. No one interrupted. This wasn't a moment to fill with noise. It was a moment to let exist. The woman stood there, broken open, but not destroyed. Humbled but not humiliated, forced to confront herself in front of strangers and given the rare grace of being allowed to grow from it. And the man, still calm, still grounded, had done what few people ever managed to do in moments like this. He had met cruelty without cruelty, hate without hatred. And in doing so, he had changed not just one woman, but everyone who stood close enough to witness it. The apology hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Sorry. 2 words, simple, trembling, honest. No one rushed to fill the silence that followed. It didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt necessary. As if the moment needed space to breathe, to settle into the walls of the store and into the people standing inside it. The man nodded once, slowly. Thank you for saying that, he replied. His voice carried no triumph, no relief, just quiet acknowledgement. What matters most is what happens after. Black man's after. The woman wiped her cheeks again, her hands shaking. She nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the realization that she had been seen, truly seen, and not destroyed by it. That alone was disarming. The cashier finally found her voice. That was beautiful, she said softly, her words trembling. She didn't try to hide her tears now. Thank you for saying what so many people are afraid to say. The man turned toward her, surprised, then smiled gently. Thank you for listening, he replied. That matters just as much. A murmur rippled through the crowd, warmer now, softer. People looked at one another differently, as if they had shared something intimate without ever speaking. Then, from the back of the group, a small voice cut through the quiet. A mister? Everyone turned. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped forward hesitantly, clutching a candy bar in one hand. His sneakers squeaked faintly against the tile as he moved, his face a mix of nervousness and determination. The man crouched slightly to meet the boy's eye level, his expression immediately warm. Yes? He said. What you said, the boy began, glancing back briefly at his mother before continuing. It was really brave. The store seemed to collectively inhale. The man smiled, touched. Thank you, he said. But you know what's even braver? The boy shook his head. Being kind, the man replied. Especially when it's hard. The boy nodded slowly as if committing the idea to memory. I'll remember that, he said earnestly. I hope you do, the man said. The world needs it. The boy beamed, retreating back to his mother's side. She mouthed thank you to the man, her eyes shining. That was when the store manager stepped forward. He cleared his throat, clearly moved, but professional enough to address the situation properly. Sir, he said, his voice steady, on behalf of our store, I want to apologize for what happened here today. That behavior is not acceptable, and we take it seriously. The man stood and extended his hand without hesitation. I appreciate that, he said. Thank you for addressing it. They shook hands firmly. The woman watched the exchange quietly, her face still red from crying. She seemed smaller now, not diminished, but humbled. When the man glanced at her, he offered a brief nod, not dismissive, not forgiving everything, just human. The tension that had once gripped the store loosened completely. People began to shift, to remember their carts and baskets, to re-enter the rhythm of everyday life, but not as the same people who had arrived. Checkout lines began to move again. The registers beeped once more, but something had changed. As the man turned back to pay for his groceries, the cashier leaned in slightly. I don't think I'll ever forget this, she said quietly. I think a lot of us won't. He smiled, tired but sincere. If it makes people think differently, he said, then it was worth it. The woman remained nearby, unsure of what to do with herself now that the moment had passed. She glanced at the man, then at the floor, then back again. Finally, she spoke. I'm glad you didn't yell at me, she said softly. I don't think I would have heard anything if you had. The man considered her for a moment. Sometimes, he said, being heard matters more than being right. She nodded, wiping her eyes one last time. I'll remember that. As the man gathered his bags, the crowd slowly dispersed. People returned to their errands, but conversations lingered. Quiet reflections whispered between spouses, parents answering difficult questions from children, strangers exchanging thoughtful looks. The moment wasn't over, it was just changing shape. As the man walked toward the exit, the afternoon sun streamed through the glass doors, casting long shadows across the floor. He paused briefly near the boy again, crouching slightly. Remember, he said gently, a kindness is strength. The boy nodded enthusiastically. I won't forget. The automatic door slid open with a soft whoosh, and the man stepped outside. Inside, the woman stood by her cart, staring at the doors long after they closed behind him. Her thoughts were heavy, unfamiliar, uncomfortable, necessary. She knew she would carry this moment with her. So would everyone else, not because it had been dramatic, not because it had gone viral, but because it had been real. A moment when words mattered, when silence spoke, when dignity changed a room. And long after the store returned to its ordinary hum, those words, the apology, the kindness, the courage, would follow everyone home. The grocery store slowly returned to its routine. Carts rolled forward, registers beeped, receipts printed and tore away with familiar mechanical sighs. On the surface, everything looked the same as it had an hour earlier. But beneath that normalcy, something had shifted. People moved differently now. A little slower, a little quieter, as if they were afraid that rushing might cause the moment they had just witnessed to slip away before it fully settled. The cashier finished her shift later that evening with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. As she clocked out, she replayed the scene in her mind. Not the insult, but the response, the calm, the restraint, the power of words chosen carefully instead of thrown like weapons. She knew she would tell the story again, to friends, to family, to anyone who would listen. Not because it was dramatic, but because it mattered. A few aisles away, the young boy walked hand in hand with his mother toward the parking lot. He asked questions on the way to the car, honest, unfiltered questions that didn't come from malice, only curiosity. Why did she say that? Why did she say that? Oh, why was he so calm? Oh, why did everyone clap? His mother answered as best she could, choosing her words carefully. She realized with a quiet ache that this moment had become a lesson, one she hadn't planned, but one she was grateful for. That night, as she tucked him into bed, he repeated the words he'd been told earlier. "A kindness is brave," he said sleepily. She smiled through tears. "Yes," she whispered. "It really is." Across town, the older woman sat alone at her kitchen table, groceries untouched on the counter. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing herself differently than she had that morning. She replayed the moment again and again, not to justify herself, but to understand herself. The calm in his voice, the stories of his family. The way he hadn't tried to humiliate her, even when he could have. She realized something uncomfortable but undeniable. No one had ever challenged her like that before. Not with anger, not with shame, but with truth. For the first time in a long while, she asked herself questions she had avoided for decades. Where did those words come from? Why had they felt so easy to say? What had she been carrying all this time? And who had taught her to carry it? The answers didn't come quickly, but the questions stayed. And that, she sensed, was the beginning of something different. Meanwhile, the man walked home under a fading sky, grocery bags swinging gently at his sides. The sun dipped low, casting the street in warm gold. To anyone passing by, he looked like any other neighbor heading home after errands. But inside, he felt the familiar weight settle in. Moments like that always did. They took something from you, even when they ended well. He thought about the crowd, the child, the woman. He wondered how long the impact would last, whether the lesson would fade or take root. He hoped. But he also knew something else. He had done what he could. He had shown restraint when rage would have been easier. He had chosen dignity when silence would have been safer. He had spoken truth not to win, but to open a door. And sometimes that was enough. The world didn't change that afternoon. A few people did. And change, he knew, rarely arrived all at once. It came in moments, small, human moments, where someone decided to respond differently than expected. Back at the store, the manager filed a report and sent a reminder to staff about values and accountability. But he knew policies weren't what people would remember. They would remember the man who didn't raise his voice, the woman who found the courage to apologize, the silence that taught more than shouting ever could. Days later, the story would resurface in conversations, not as gossip, but as reflection. "I saw something today. You won't believe what happened. It made me think." And each retelling would carry the lesson forward, reshaped by the person sharing it, passed along like a quiet torch. Because moments like these don't end when the doors close. They linger. They challenge assumptions. They soften hardened edges. They remind people, sometimes uncomfortably, that humanity is shared, whether acknowledged or not. The world is loud with anger, quick with judgment, hungry for outrage. But every once in a while, a moment cuts through the noise. Not with shouting, not with fists, but with calm courage. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. People listen, people feel, people remember. So if this story stays with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see something differently, don't let it stop here. Carry it forward. Speak up when silence protects harm. Use dignity when anger feels justified. Teach kindness not because it's easy, but because it's brave. Because change doesn't always come from grand speeches or viral moments. Sometimes it begins in a grocery store line with one person who refused to respond to hate with hate, and a room full of strangers who left just a little more human than they arrived.